For more than a decade, Marcus Chen served as a primary architect for American economic interests on the global stage, representing the United States in the most high-stakes trade negotiations imaginable. His career was defined by the tense atmosphere of windowless chambers in Geneva, the high-pressure boardrooms of Shanghai, and the bureaucratic corridors of the World Trade Organization. In these hidden spaces, the fundamental rules of the global economy are either forged through painstaking compromise or allowed to crumble into chaos. Chen possesses an intimate, battle-tested understanding of what it looks like when America negotiates from a position of absolute strength. And conversely, he knows exactly what it looks like when the United States is backed into a corner. Recently, from the quiet of his home office in Virginia, he scrutinized the joint communique released following the 2026 summit between the American president and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. After analyzing the text with the precision of a forensic investigator, he reached a conclusion that should send a chill through anyone concerned with the future of Western prosperity. His assessment was simple yet devastating. The true story of this summit isn't found in what the document says, but in what it conspicuously fails to mention. Chen serves as a composite voice for a specialized group of former high-ranking trade officials who have gone public with their concerns regarding the trajectory of U.S.-China relations in 2026. Their collective insight points to a singular, alarming reality. When the leader of the free world travels to Beijing accompanied by the Treasury Secretary, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the most influential CEOs on the planet, one expects a monumental breakthrough. Yet, when the resulting joint statement lacks even a single concrete commitment from China on the most pressing issues facing the American economy, you aren't looking at a diplomatic achievement. You are looking at a profound strategic defeat. As of May 2026, the scoreboard is undeniable, and it shows China in the lead while the United States remains at zero. To understand why this moment represents such a tectonic shift in global power, we have to look past the carefully curated press releases and dissect the actual leverage at play. We need to examine what the administration went to Beijing to secure, what Xi Jinping was willing to offer, and more importantly, what he decided to withhold. This isn't just about trade policy. It is about the most significant realignment of the global order since the fall of the Berlin Wall. What most mainstream media outlets are overlooking is a structural inversion of power that, once recognized, changes your entire perception of the modern world. On the surface, the May 2026 summit was presented as a stabilizing win for Washington. After years of escalating hostility, punitive tariffs, technological embargoes, and a relentless cycle of sanctions, the two most powerful men on Earth sat down face-to-face for the first time in nearly a decade. They managed to sign a shared declaration and found common ground on the nuclear ambitions of Iran. The presence of corporate titans from NVIDIA, Apple, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, and Boeing suggested that the gears of global commerce might finally begin turning again. By every traditional metric of diplomatic optics, the meeting appeared to be a success. But the headlines are hiding a much darker reality. This summit was not a Chinese initiative born out of a desire for peace. It was the direct result of an urgent American request. The United States was the party that petitioned for the meeting, and China was the party that graciously agreed to host it. In the sophisticated language of international diplomacy, this asymmetry is everything. The nation that asks for the meeting is almost always the nation that is operating from a position of need. The United States traveled to Beijing to seek help for a crisis it essentially triggered itself. A crisis it now finds itself unable to resolve without Chinese cooperation. To trace the origins of this predicament, we have to look back to the spring of 2025. At that time, the Trump administration launched a massive, scorched-earth tariff offensive aimed at nearly every significant trading partner the U.S. had. The goal was to aggressively correct decades of trade imbalances, force a manufacturing renaissance on American soil, and exert an unprecedented level of economic pain on Beijing. At the height of this campaign, tariffs on Chinese imports were hiked to a staggering 145%. In practical terms, a 145% tariff is no longer a tax. It is a total blockade. It is the economic equivalent of slamming the door shut and bolting the locks. Scott Bessent, the billionaire hedge fund veteran serving as Treasury Secretary, took to the airwaves in 2025 to project an image of absolute confidence. He argued that the United States held every significant card in the deck and that China was playing a losing hand with no viable moves left. However, that confidence was built on a foundation of obsolete data and a fundamental misunderstanding of how much the world had changed. The administration's strategy relied on the outdated assumption that China's prosperity was still inextricably tied to the American consumer, just as it had been in the 1990s when a quarter of all Chinese exports were destined for U.S. shores. If that reality had remained static, the 145% tariffs might have been the ultimate lever. But Washington's strategists failed to grasp that Beijing had spent the last decade armor-plating its economy against exactly this type of assault. Since the first major trade disruptions in 2018, China has been systematically re-engineering its trade DNA. By the time 2025 arrived, the United States had already been dethroned as China's primary export market. That title now belongs to ASEAN, the powerful 10-nation bloc of Southeast Asian economies. China's trade volume with its immediate neighbors and the broader global South now dwarfs its commerce with the United States or even the European Union. When Washington finally decided to cut off access to the American market, they discovered that China had already constructed a network of alternative exits. The massive leverage the U.S. thought it possessed had effectively evaporated while Washington wasn't looking. Beijing's response to the 145% tariffs wasn't a desperate plea for mercy, it was a surgical counterstrike. They hit back with highly targeted 77% tariffs on American beef and 22% on soybeans, specifically designed to hollow out the profit margins of the very agricultural states that formed the president's political base. As American farmers began to see their livelihoods vanish, China prepared to play its most dangerous card, one that Washington had feared for years but hoped would never be drawn. This brings us to the critical issue of rare earth elements, a detail that explains the true power dynamics of the Beijing Summit better than any official statement ever could. Most people never think about elements like neodymium, dysprosium, or terbium, but these 17 metallic minerals are the literal lifeblood of the 21st century. They are the indispensable ingredients in high-end semiconductors, the high-performance motors in electric vehicles, the guidance systems of cruise missiles, and the engines of the world's most advanced fighter jets. There are no substitutes. Without them, the modern world and the modern military simply stops functioning. China doesn't just participate in this market. They dominate it with a level of control that has no historical equivalent. While they account for roughly 60% of the world's mining, their real power lies in processing. China controls about 85% of the global capacity to refine these ores into usable materials. Even if a country manages to dig these minerals out of their own ground, they almost always have to ship them to China to make them functional. In early 2025, when China retaliated against U.S. tariffs by choking off the export of these minerals, the shockwaves hit the American defense and technology sectors with terrifying force. The alarm in the corporate world was palpable. NVIDIA, the $3.5 trillion titan of the AI revolution, saw its dominant position in the Chinese market evaporate almost overnight due to U.S. export bans, and now it faced a supply chain crisis from the other side. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, had spent years trying to navigate a path back into the Chinese market, and his presence on Air Force One during the trip to Beijing was a signal of pure desperation. He wasn't alone. Tim Cook of Apple was there, representing a company whose entire manufacturing heart is still deeply rooted in Chinese soil despite years of political pressure to relocate. Larry Fink of BlackRock, overseeing more than $10 trillion in assets, was also present. The message from the American private sector was deafening. The trade war was no longer an abstract policy debate. It was a structural threat to the viability of the American corporate machine. They needed a deal, and they needed it immediately. This was the backdrop of the summit. The U.S. government arrived not as a conquering force, but as the representative of a wounded economic ecosystem that was paying a heavy price for a conflict it was no longer winning. Xi Jinping, ever the strategist, played the role of the gracious statesman. He provided the pomp, the circumstance, and the formal dinners, but when it came time to sign the document, he gave up nothing of strategic consequence. The most glaring omission in the joint statement, one that has been largely ignored by the 24-hour news cycle, is the complete lack of any Chinese commitment to resolve the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. To understand why this is a catastrophic failure for American diplomacy, you have to understand the geography of global energy. The Strait of Hormuz is a tiny maritime choke point, only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest, yet it carries 20% of the entire planet's oil supply. Every major Gulf producer, from Saudi Arabia to Iraq, relies on this single waterway to reach the world. Since the U.S. military became entangled with Iran in early 2025, the Iranian Navy has effectively seized control of this passage. Through a combination of drone swarms and anti-ship missiles, they have made commercial shipping through the strait a high-risk gamble. The result has been a vertical spike in global oil prices, which has fed directly into American inflation. In a nation where the price of a gallon of gas determines the political fate of presidents, this isn't just an economic metric, it's a political emergency. Inflation has surged well past the Federal Reserve's targets, and the resulting cost of living crisis has sent the president's approval ratings into a tailspin. The United States desperately needed China to step in and fix this. China is the only nation with the necessary leverage over Tehran, as they purchase a staggering 80% of all Iranian oil exports. For Iran, the economic relationship with Beijing is the only thing keeping the lights on under the weight of Western sanctions. If Xi Jinping had signaled even a slight displeasure with the blockade, the situation in the Strait would have changed overnight. But in the joint statement, there was no commitment. There was no timeline. There was no mechanism for cooperation. When asked about it later, the president could only offer a vague paraphrase of Xi saying he would like to be of help, if possible. In the world of high diplomacy, that is a polite way of saying no. Joint statements between superpowers are not written in a vacuum. Every word is fought over, and every omission is a calculated choice. By refusing to include language on the Strait of Hormuz, China made a deliberate decision to let the American economic wound continue to bleed. The second massive void in the agreement was the status of rare earth minerals. There was no mention of China lifting its export restrictions or even a framework for future discussions. The stranglehold on the American defense and tech industries remains as tight as ever. Furthermore, as the American delegation was actually touching down in Beijing, a highly choreographed event took place thousands of miles away. Iran suddenly granted safe passage to a fleet of Chinese tankers through the very strait they were blocking for everyone else. It was a masterclass in signaling. It told the world that China doesn't need to negotiate for access. They already have it through their special relationship with Tehran. The message to the president was clear. The blockade is an American problem, and China feels no pressure to solve a crisis that is only hurting its rival. Marcus Chen's observation has never been more relevant. The power balance has completely inverted. For decades, Washington operated under the delusion that China needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed China. The 2026 Beijing Summit is the moment that illusion finally shattered on the world stage. Perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire summit occurred during the opening remarks when Xi Jinping explicitly invoked the Thucydides trap. This concept, rooted in the writings of the ancient Greek historian who chronicled the war between Athens and Sparta, suggests that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, violent conflict becomes almost inevitable. Harvard scholars have noted that in 12 out of 16 historical instances where this dynamic occurred, the result was a catastrophic war. By mentioning this concept while standing next to the American president, Xi was not making an academic observation. He was delivering a direct two-layered message to the West. The first layer was a performative desire for peace, a call to transcend history and find a new way to coexist. But the second layer was far more aggressive. By invoking the trap, Xi was publicly declaring that China is no longer a developing nation seeking a seat at the table. He was stating that China is now a peer competitor, if not a superior one, and that any future cooperation is strictly conditional. The primary condition for this peaceful coexistence is one that the U.S. finds nearly impossible to swallow: Taiwan. Xi was blunt, stating that the entire stability of the global relationship, trade, finance, and security, rests entirely on how the Taiwan question is handled. In the measured, often opaque world of Chinese diplomacy, using the word conflict in this context is the equivalent of a shouted warning. He was making it clear that while China is willing to manage economic competition, their claim to Taiwan is non-negotiable. Any American administration that tries to use Taiwan as a bargaining chip will find that all Chinese cooperation vanishes instantly. For a president who views everything through the lens of a transaction, this was a stark reminder that some things cannot be bought or sold. The timing of this warning, delivered exactly when the U.S. was most desperate for economic relief, was a calculated move to exploit American vulnerability. So, where does this leave the global order as we move deeper into 2026? We are no longer in a period of American hegemony, nor are we in a new era of partnership. We are in a state of managed, high-stakes competition where the traditional roles of leader and follower have become blurred. The United States entered this summit in a position of structural need, hampered by a trade war that has become a self-inflicted wound. China entered the summit having already insulated itself from American pressure and holding the keys to both the global energy market and the high-tech supply chain. Looking forward, there are three primary paths this could take. The first is a messy, managed de-escalation. This would involve both sides quietly walking back the most destructive tariffs and export bans to prevent a total economic collapse. It wouldn't be a grand peace treaty, but rather a series of quiet back-channel fixes to keep the gears of the global economy from seizing up. Nvidia might get partial market access back, and Apple might get supply chain guarantees, while the U.S. tones down its rhetoric on the international stage. The second scenario is a slow-motion stalemate. In this version of the future, the goodwill from the summit evaporates quickly, replaced by domestic political pressures in both countries. The U.S. continues to try and de-risk its economy, while China keeps its grip on rare earths and energy flows. The global economy would have to learn to live with permanently higher inflation and energy costs, creating a world of slow growth and constant friction. This is an inherently unstable path that eventually forces a choice between a breakthrough or a total breakdown. The third and most terrifying scenario is total escalation. A single miscalculation, a naval accident in the South China Sea, a provocative arms sale to Taiwan, or a clash in the Strait of Hormuz could trigger a rapid unraveling. In this event, the global economy would split into two entirely separate, incompatible ecosystems. The rare earth ban would become total, the tech decoupling would be absolute, and the prosperity of the last 40 years would become a memory. This is the outcome that keeps veteran negotiators like Marcus Chen awake at night, because the guardrails that used to prevent such a fall are currently more fragile than they have been in a generation. For the average person, these geopolitical maneuvers might seem distant, but their impact will be felt at every kitchen table in the country. The reality is that the U.S.-China relationship over the next year will dictate the price of your groceries, the cost of filling your gas tank, and the stability of your retirement account more than any domestic policy. For decades, China essentially exported low prices to the United States, helping to offset the rising costs of housing and healthcare. That era is over. The trade war has reversed that flow, and we are now importing inflation. If the tensions from the Beijing Summit aren't resolved, the cost of living crisis facing American families will become a permanent fixture of life. This isn't a political opinion, it's a mechanical reality of global trade, and the 2026 summit failed to provide a solution. When Marcus Chen looked at that joint statement, he saw the architectural drawings of a new world, one where the United States no longer dictates the terms of engagement. The absence of a deal on the Strait of Hormuz, the silence on rare earths, and the ironclad warning on Taiwan are the true takeaways from this meeting. We have officially entered an era of peer competition where China holds structural advantages that the United States cannot simply tariff away. We are witnessing the formalization of a reality where the U.S. must learn to navigate a world it no longer fully controls. The summit happened because the U.S. needed it, the document says the most through what it omits, and the warning about the Thucydides trap is a literal roadmap for the dangers ahead. We are locked in a struggle where the cost of losing is total, but the cost of winning might be just as high. the geopolitical landscape just became significantly more dangerous. And the clarity we gained in Beijing this week suggests that the road ahead will be the most difficult the West has ever traveled. If you found this analysis valuable, consider sharing it with those who need to see past the headlines, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Did China just outmaneuver the US, or is there a deeper game being played that we haven't seen yet? The next time we talk, we'll dive into the Iranian perspective and why their current strategy might be a ticking time bomb for the entire region.